Hi, everybody. Welcome to A Mighty Blaze. We are having very, very special cocktails this evening for Sister Stardust, the new amazing book by our special guest, Queen Jane Green. Welcome back, Jane. We are so excited, as always, to host you on The Blaze.
Oh, I am so happy to be back with you. Thank you, Jenna.
Oh my God, we're so excited for you. I'm so excited to talk about this luscious, luscious book. Those of you who know Jane, which is everybody, unless you have been living like in a cave, under a rock, on a different planet, in a different solar system and galaxy for the last 700 years.
Oh, have I
No.
called myself Jane Grebe? Is that my typing?
Yes, your name is Jane Grebe now.
Jane Grebe. Okay, Jane Grebe works, but Grebe.
Jane Grebe. We don't have Jane Green with us tonight. We have Jane Grebe. So meanwhile, we have like her evil twin, Jane Grebe, which is going to make this even more fun. But those of you who know Jane Grebe know that everything she writes is a bestseller because everybody loves the warmth of which she writes her characters and their stories and their very relatable life dramas. This is her first historical fiction, and so we are especially excited to talk tonight about Sister Stardust. It's like the story of like fantastic, impossible glamour and also tragedy. So I am super, super excited to talk about this. Let me do a little bit of a commercial for The Blaze. For those of you who might be joining us for the first time, Mighty Blaze is an organization of 35 professional creative volunteers dedicated to helping connect readers and writers in the age of COVID, Delta, Omicron, Ovigacron, Deltacron, whatever, Ukraine atrocities. Like, we are here to bring books and writers to you always. And if you like what you see here, please give us a like or a follow on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Goodreads. We are ubiquitous. And please consider signing up for our newsletter so that you can keep abreast of all the incredible guests we have, like Jane Green. And you'll never have literary FOMO ever again. No mo FOMO. Nobody likes that. Jane, I'm just going to make this brief because I just want to talk to you, lovely, is the author of 18 New York Times bestsellers and 19 USA Today bestsellers. Jane is a former journalist in the UK and a graduate of the International Culinary Center in New York. Her many, many novels include Jemima J., The Beach House, Falling, Sunshine Sisters, and most recently, The Friends We Keep. And she has published one cookbook, Good Taste, which is luscious, as Jane is herself. And again, we are here to talk about Sister Stardust this evening, Jane's first and well-reviewed and beautifully received and Indie Next Picks historical fiction. So, Jane, would you please tell us in your own words what this sumptuous book is about?
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Sister Stardust is well, it's about a woman called Claire, who is a quiet country mouse who lives in London during the 1960s. Well, she grows up in the country, and it's at a time when London burst into colour and burst into life after all those very hard years recovering from the war. And she wants to go to London and experience every drop of life that she can. Once she gets there, she sort of falls in with a crowd of musicians and aristocrats, and they whisk her off to Marrakesh to stay with Paul and Talita Getty. And Paul Getty II was the son of the richest man in the world, the oil baron Paul Getty, and his wife Talita was a Dutch actress and socialite who was described by all who knew her as an enchantress. And they bought a dilapidated palace in Marrakesh on their honeymoon and threw the doors open on New Year's Eve 1967. And anyone was there, including John Lennon and Paul McCartney, who spent the whole night flat on their backs, so stoned they couldn't actually get up off the floor. And that was the thing, that they would hold these magical parties. And Talita, as a child, had spent her early years in a Japanese internment camp and experienced quite a bit of torture from the guards. And I think she carried tremendous pain actually throughout her life and tried to hide it by the parties and the running and surrounding herself with people. And Claire falls under her spell not realizing quite how dangerous that lifestyle will be, nor the tragedy that's waiting to happen. And that is Sister Stardust.
That was a beautiful description. I have to say that about you, it's kind of the same thing my dad used to say, that he would listen to Bobby De Niro read the phone book, and I could hear you describe the back of a macaroni and cheese box, and I would be just entranced and beguiled. But I have to say that adding beautiful you and your voice to this book is like a double exponential treat, because this book is so glamorous and yet is so human. Like, I feel as though you take London in the 60s, Marrakesh anytime, and then wealth and this particular subset of people who could do basically anything without consequence, or so they thought. And you basically have like glamour waiting to happen and also tragedy waiting to explode. How did you find your way into this novel? Was it Claire, who I think of now as Cece, because that becomes her nickname, or Talita?
It was Talita, who has been my kind of lifelong obsession. You know, I first saw a picture of her when I was a teenager, and I was just instantly mesmerized. It's a very famous photograph of her almost semi-lounging in a cat-like pose on a rooftop in Morocco. Actually, you know what? I have this photograph. Yes, and here is the version of the actual one that I saw. And there's her husband Paul in a hooded robe, and the sort of the mystery in her eyes and the beauty of the kaftan and of Talita. And actually, what I saw in her eyes, even when I was very young, was something that I recognized as sadness or some kind of mystery. I now know that in fact it was sadness, and it was also that she was so high during that photo shoot that Vogue almost didn't run the pictures. But these were all things I found out during the research. And Talita just had been somebody who I was always fascinated with and wanted to find out more about. When my editor said, have you ever considered writing historical fiction? I immediately knew that Talita Getty's story was the one I wanted to tell. And by the way, it's also a theme, I think, in this is not a typical Jane Green novel in so many ways. I mean, it is, whether you call it historical fiction, historical biography, biographical fiction, you know, it is all based on real people and real events. And yet the themes are somehow the same, which is that nothing is ever what it seems, and that money doesn't bring you happiness, and that you cannot ever judge people because we do not know what goes on behind closed doors. And here were Paul and Talita Getty, the most glamorous people in the world. He was living on a trust fund at the time, the dividends of his trust fund of $100,000 a year, which at that time in 1966 was enormous. And Vogue would write about them all the time. Yves Saint Laurent called her his muse, and Vogue would write, you know, Mrs. Getty travels the souks. She walks the souks in the morning to go and find entertainers for her guests at night. So she'd walk around the souks in Marrakesh and bring back jugglers and acrobats and magicians and snake charmers to come and entertain at these sort of bacchanalian feasts that she would have on her rooftop with tons of people, it was counterculture, so everybody was doing the North African hippie trail. And of course it looked impossibly glamorous and wild and like a magic carpet ride through Arabian Nights. And yet behind closed doors, it turns out she was an extrovert running from the pain of her childhood. He was an introvert who couldn't stand all the people staying in their house. There was a deep love for each other, but they were extraordinarily mismatched. And he, I think, to hide his pain, dived into first opium addiction and then heroin addiction. She was also doing opium and heroin, although alcohol was really her drug of choice. And actually, there were terrible things ahead that you would never have known, because to look at them, you would think they had everything in the world and would not need anything. And actually, their lives were so incredibly troubled.
It is a Jane Green novel, because I think that all of your books feature people who are delving beneath the surface of other people's lives, that they start out with an impression that there is a situation that is cushy or enviable in some way, and then the common denominator is that we are all just people. When you were delving yourself into writing about Talita, knowing that she was an icon, and I mean, looking at the photo of her and seeing the sadness in her eyes, um, was there a particular challenge about writing about real people? Like, did you feel this was actually like not even a subject on my list, but I know that you have a sort of a love affair is not quite right, but this very tender feeling toward this heroine. And what were some of the challenges in writing about her actual story and sort of representing, I guess, the true story?
Honestly, it was, I think, because I was very cognizant of her son still being alive, very much alive, of there being many people around who knew her and loved her. I wanted to take enormous care with how I wrote her. And so this is, by the way, this is also why I was a terrible journalist, because I could never write anything that would upset anyone. And I hated the thought of tarnishing her memory in some way. And I think, if anything, I wanted her to be remembered, because she was, and she wasn't an educated woman, but she had extraordinary emotional intelligence, and was just truly described as magical by everybody that knew her. She was a free spirit, and she really created bohemian chic, the whole look. I mean, it all started with her, and actually even 50 years later there are so many top fashion designers who cite her as an ongoing influence. And I wanted her to be remembered and to be treated with care and remembered with love. So I think I was just, I was careful with how I wrote. And now I don't remember the beginning of your question. So
no, that is exactly like the challenges of writing about a real person. I've written historical fiction, but not written about real people. And I think you beautifully answered the question.
But there is more. Hold on. There's a part 2 to that. Thank you for reminding me of a question. The part 2 is that I also knew that somebody like Mick Jagger, who is still alive and is probably quite litigious, if I was going to put Mick Jagger in, which I did, it would have to be something fairly anodyne. So a lot of the real people who are still around, they do appear, but in a completely innocuous ways, where I think any lawyer would be really hard pushed to say, no, there is no case here. And a lot of the storyline was inspired by the Rolling Stones, which I hadn't expected. Actually, I hadn't understood the links that the Rolling Stones had to Morocco and to the Gettys. But rather than writing about Brian Jones, Anita Pallenberg, and Keith Richards as them, I used their story and that particular love triangle to inspire the story within Sister Stardust.
I should mention that the Publisher's Weekly review of Sister Stardust reads like this. Henry, stop scratching. Sorry, Henry is scratching. Henry, enough. I should have given him one of these cocktails, a Sister Stardust cocktail, and knocked him out before the interview. Green convincingly describes the appeal of the music scene, as well as the allure of her beautiful characters, both famous and fictional. Green's fans will be delighted at this story of glitter and tragedy. And you got starred reviews for this book, so you're getting a lot of love for it. And not just because of Talita and because people love you, but because it's a whole new sort of taste treat about you writing about real people, sort of bio hist-fic.
Yeah. And also, I think, I have so loved reading Daisy Jones and the Six and Malibu Rising and Mary Jane and all of those amazing books that all deal with the 60s and the 70s in America. But I haven't read a lot about that time period in Europe. And the truth is, I'd love to think that I could write something like that in America, but I couldn't, because it's not part of my DNA. Whereas I was born in 1968 in London. I grew up in London, and I remember, you know, as a child, I remember my mother in kind of floaty chiffon evening gowns, and the glamour of those times, and the stories that I heard about when my mum and dad, before they were married, my mum would go to the Ad Lib Club and all the clubs, and you'd sort of rub shoulders with the Beatles, and it was no big deal, and I just felt that it was part of my DNA, and that was a story I could write.
Let's talk about crushes and nostalgia because I remember my parents getting dressed up. I was born in 70. And I remember my parents getting dressed up to go into New York, and my mom with her like sort of Dorothy Hamill haircut and her fur coat and her Chanel number 5, and my dad in his suit, and they're going in to like have their cocktails and they're dancing at like the Rainbow Room or whatever. And I still have a crush on that era that I never lived in. And I feel as though some part of me inhabited it just from like my memory and my idolization of that era. When you were writing this, do you feel that you were able to like fully enter the era? Do you wish you had been able to experience it as an adult?
So I, like you, also have this extraordinary pull to it's the late 60s up until the mid 70s. Like you know, once you hit the late 70s, I'm kind of over it. But there is that time period. It's for me just an age of, you know, there was still elegance in the world and glamour and freedom, and people were, there were so many firsts. It was the first for psychedelic drugs. It was the first for sex, certainly in England, sex as a pleasurable activity rather than conjugal duties just to, you know, keep your husband happy. In fact, we even had a phrase that I remember from growing up: you'd lie back and think of England. It was not supposed to be about enjoyment. And then suddenly in 1963, you know, we had the pill. But I don't know. I don't know whether it's because of my mum, and I suspect that is something to do with it. But just that whole time frame, it's the music of my childhood, and the tricky bit here was getting Marrakesh as well. But I spent almost a year researching, and I knew that I couldn't start writing this until I knew what it felt to be there. And because I'm slightly binary, just a little, I'm very black and white, and I'm very obsessive, I dived in. I mean, all I talked about, thought about, read about for a year was Talita Getty, the Rolling Stones, you know, Groovy Bob, Robert Fraser, Michael Cooper. I mean, all the people that were around that time, and I read everything I could get my hands on. And at a certain point, I started to feel like when I started to write it, and then I could feel it. And I'd been to Marrakesh a couple of years before writing this book, and I think Marrakesh just had this tremendous impact on me. I almost fell in love with Marrakesh because of my obsession with Talita and her photograph. And then I went to Marrakesh, and you know, as soon as you enter the gates of the walled city, and the smells are, everything is brighter and stronger and richer, and you've got orange trees everywhere, and you've got the smell of orange blossom mingling with an early evening. The fire pits, just, they light the sandalwood logs, and with the rawness of the animal heads hanging in the suits and the spices, and it all kind of mingles together to create something that's just very alive, and everything is brighter. It is, Morocco is a cold country with a hot sun. And so you'll come out of a dark cobbled alleyway, and you'll be freezing, and you'll have your puffer coat on, and you'll step into a pool of sunlight, and it will just be heat. And it's a country of extremes, and a feast for the senses. And so I already knew what Marrakesh was like. I could feel Marrakesh, and the beauty of a place like Marrakesh is it doesn't change that much. The architecture is still the same, and it really, I could feel it, and I could feel the Gettys there, and something about the wildness of the parties, and I really felt it. I also was removed from my life, which helped. I don't know if I could have done it had I been here in Westport, but I went back to England to research it, and and I ended up writing it in England, and my husband wasn't with me for a lot of the time, and so I had nobody else to think about. I could just live in this world, and I did.
I remember this because I follow Jane on Instagram, as so many of us do, and if you don't, you should, because her Instagram is a treat to behold, and it is so sensory and so sensually oriented that you can almost taste everything that she posts about cooking and feel the fabrics, and it's just that's where I go when I want an escape from my own life. But I remember when you went to England to write this, and I remember talking about this time period when I came out with The Lost Family, which was set in 1965, and you saying I always wanted to set something in that time period, and then you did, and you have this beautiful product, this beautiful book. Do you, if you had a choice, would you live in that time period? Like if you could go there and then not come back, would you go and stay? Or would you stay here and look back with a long lens?
God, that's a great question. I mean, I think that time period was, I'm going to answer it like a politician, which means I'm not really going to answer it. Because the thing is, that time period, I think I probably would want to go back there, actually, although I know that however much I romanticize it, I'm also nostalgic for a world that probably was nothing like, I don't know, maybe it was. I have to say, so I got very lucky during the research of this book, and I ended up talking to a couple of friends of Talita's. And one of them, we became quite friendly, and we spent quite a lot of time on the phone together. And at the certain point, I thought, well, I have to send her the book. And I was so nervous because she was there. And she phoned me up a few days later and she said, well, you got one thing wrong. And I thought, oh, what? And it turns out there's a scene in the book where Claire, who's renamed Cece, gets to Marrakesh. And because it's on such a whim, it was such an impulsive decision, she has nothing with her. And there's a knock on the door of her bedroom after she arrives at Sidi Majoon, and a houseboy is standing there with his arms filled with clothes that Talita has given for Cece to wear. And my friend phoned and said, Talita was far too self-centered. She would never have lent anybody her clothes, which I thought was kind of hilarious because I had just, to me, she was the ideal woman, generous, kind, loving, all the good things. I never thought of her as being self-centered. But this woman then said, I've read many, many books about the 60s, and I have never read anything like this because everything I've read about the 60s has sensationalized the sex and the drugs and the rock and roll. But you, she said, have done something I have never seen done before, which is you captured how it felt. And I have, every time I say that, the goosebumps come back. And that was the highest praise I could have got. And I also sort of understood it because I felt that I was there. So anyway, that very long-winded answer to your question, would I go back, is I think I probably would go back because I kind of think that it probably did feel rather wonderful. There was huge darkness. I mean, the truth is you can't live that kind of wild and free lifestyle without there being severe consequences. So many people lost their lives way too young. I mean, Brian Jones, who inspired much of the story, Sister Stardust, was found drowned in his swimming pool in his house, Oxford Farm, in 1969. Janis Joplin, I mean, all the 27, Jim Morrison, there were so many that died so young. And I think, that is still hard on people who have survived them. I mean, I know a lot of people who I approached did not want to go back to the past. And I imagine it must hold quite a bit of pain for many.
I think, true confession, Jane and I are friends, and I think she's kind of reading my mind because she's answering all the questions that I had prepared about this book.
Oh, no. Is this going to be a super short interview then? All right, darling.
We're just going to drink instead. And Anissa, who is like our party girl, asked what the cocktails were tonight. This is a Sister Stardust. It is a Negroni with a sparkler in it, and maybe or maybe not some hashish. Who knows?
So I have in my fridge, actually, this might be why I'm a bit out of it, because I did get, so one of the delicacies of Sidi Mamoon, whenever guests would arrive at the Gettys, was Talita would always give them the house delicacy was something called Majoon, which is an old Marrakesh delicacy, and it's little balls of, it's almost like a fudge made out of chopped dates, figs, rosewater, cardamom, cinnamon, pistachios, almonds, and cannabis. And so I decided that I would make some for my launch party.
Oh, Jane.
So I made a great big bowl of Majoon balls. And then what we decided, even though it's legal now, we decided the safest thing to do would be to keep the bowl very close to me and only offer it to people who asked, because there were like 120 people at this party, many of whom I didn't know. So I had the bowl very safely next to me. But of course, it was my launch party. I had to go and speak, I had to go and see people, had to run around the room. And at one point I came back and there was a little old lady with white hair standing there eating a ball, saying, "This is delicious." And I went, no, that has cannabis. It was terrible. I felt, anyway, luckily they weren't very strong, but I may or may not have had a couple this afternoon. So I think that's why I'm losing my train of thought. I apologize.
No, it's research. It's just that, you now need to send balls to everybody who is watching this chat. So all of y'all put your address in the chat, and Jane will send you balls of cannabis.
Balls, yes.
Balls. It's balls. Like, I'm from New Jersey, so it's balls. Like, there are balls in the book. There are balls of cannabis. It's an amazing book. Now, I think I love that story. And that makes it even better. Let's talk about food. I actually had in my list of questions the recipes in the book. We all know that you are an incredible cook, an incredible foodie. You have put out a cookbook with like beautiful photos of like things that you cook yourself. And again, on Jane's Instagram, guys, if you're not already aficionados, you should go and look, because there's often food. And for people like me, who are basically a yellow lab who wakes up thinking about food, and then what else am I going to eat? And also I'm going to eat soon. And also it is just a treat. So tell us about the recipes in this book. And I will say, by the way, I did not bookmark this page, but I literally opened directly to the recipe. Like, they're embedded in there, people.
Yeah, there are only a couple. I mean, I've done this a lot before, and I know some people love it. Some people find it very odd. A woman said to me the other night, it's very quirky. And if that is the case, then I like that, because I like to think of myself as having a little bit of that classic English eccentricity. And if that involves putting recipes in books, so be it. With this one, I put in, I mean, it is, I actually have, Talita did serve Majoon. She also would often make the Alice B. Toklas chocolate fudge recipe. And so I put that in with hashish, and my editor tried on numerous occasions to take it out, and I kept putting it back in. So the recipes were pulled out, went back in, were pulled out, went back in, and I'm really glad that they stayed in. And then there's also like the bizarreness of a southern cheese souffle recipe, because actually Bill Willis, who was the decorator that introduced the Gettys to the palace and was their guide when they first came to Marrakesh on their honeymoon, he was from Kentucky, and he spent the rest of his life in Marrakesh, and he adored everything Moroccan, but he missed his mother's cooking, and so he taught his Moroccan chef Habibi to make his mother's southern souffle. So I just thought, well, that has to go in. And also, how can you write a book that's a feast for the senses without having food in there?
Oh, 1,000% agree. One of the reasons that I loved reading Nora Ephron's books, especially Heartburn, is that she was the first author that I know of to put the recipes in the book. And I just thought, what an amazing way to connect and demonstrate love for food, and also to connect with your readers. And you have continued this tradition. It's one of the many, many reasons that I always pre-order a Jane Green book long before, when it's still a gleam in your eye. So, right? It's amazing. So I would like to know more about the drugs and the sex, because it's me. Like, I have to ask about this. But one of the things you said earlier that I find so amazing is you were talking about the olfactory experience of Marrakesh and that it was a cold city with a hot sun, and how you step out and you smell the fires and the orange trees and the rawness of the animal heads hanging in the souks. And I love that you are building this multi-sensory experience for your readers. And part of that, it's so brave in this book, is exploring the sort of dark side of that multisensory experience. That Claire slash Cece is a little bit of a Dorothy Gale character. She goes from England slash Kansas to this place where everything is technicolor and everything is beyond her realm of experience. And she gets plunged as an innocence into things that are intensely pleasurable and also potentially very dangerous. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think that was the thing about those times and that sort of lifestyle. And these are the things that I had never thought about before I started researching this. Yes, we'd hear free love, but actually I didn't quite realize how, I mean, most of those parties at the Gettys became orgies towards the end. I mean, it really was free love. Everybody was sleeping with everybody else. And then there's another side to that where many women were accused of, if they said no, because the pill was there was no reason to say no. And they were worried they would be accused of not being groovy if they didn't do it. And sex became very transactional for many. And it was like having a cup of tea. It didn't really mean anything. And even though the women at the time, you know, acted as if that was all fine, actually so many people that I discovered in the research, so many women said they actually didn't like that time. They were just too frightened to actually say that they wanted a relationship or they felt a certain way. And there were jealousies as well, you know, when married couples were having outside dalliances, as you know, as they all in that particular crowd. And I'm not saying that everybody was doing it, but in that crowd of, you know, Keith Richards and Anita Pallenberg and Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull and Paul and Shalita Getty, Prince Dardo, Ruspoli, I mean, all of their friends, they were all sort of pleasure seekers. They were sybarites, and they would take pleasure wherever they found it. And because it was so new, it was all so new, they didn't understand, I think, the dangers that might be waiting for them, and also the damage that it would do to their relationships. I mean, Paul and Talita really embraced this free love, wonderful lifestyle and ended up destroying each other. I mean, Talita died at the age of 30 of a tragic heroin overdose.
Oh God. Do you think so? I was reading this, casting myself, as I think many readers might, or maybe it's just me, like in the role of the narrator, which in this book is Claire slash Cece. And she's a little bit of a Nick Carraway character in some sense. Like she is an outsider to the scene, comes in, finds everything impossibly glamorous, and swiftly realizes that not everything is as it seems, and yet is helpless to look away and helpless to pull away. And I thought, me being me, like I would put myself in her position and instantly like fall off the cliff and like overdose, or like be in an orgy with 17 people and be like, what even happened? You know, I mean, I just am very experience driven that way, and probably would get into much more difficulty than Cece would. And I, by the way, I have long wanted to write a book called The Sybarites, about people just like exploring the side of pleasure and like the downside of pleasure. Like, I think this is such a fascinating topic, like the dark side of like things that feel good. Do you think, like, I know about myself, I would have gone in and been like, oh, look, like little chocolate balls, and eaten 15 of them and been like, oh, you're cute. And then like, you know, totally like fallen off stuff. If you could have, you know, this about me, you know, this is true. So if you could go back and be in Cece's position, how do you think you would have reacted?
Well, I think sadly, Cece, I think there is so much of me in Cece, because what Cece is inherently and at her core the rule follower, but she wants not to be. she sees the wildness and the freedom, and she wants to be that, even though it doesn't come naturally to her. And eventually she does get swept up. I mean, I don't know. I have two sides of my personality, actually. I am completely a rule follower, and I'm also very passionate and extreme, and I know that I'm not very good at doing anything by halves. I'm very much all or nothing. So I imagine that I probably would have totally binged on the Majoon, not even realizing. Actually, you know what would have happened? I would have got there. I would have like kept eating those balls all night long, and while everybody else was chatting and smoking opium, I would have just been stuffing the balls. At some point, I got green. My kids, what do my kids call it? Greening out. And that's not because of my name, but it actually is called greening out. I would start greening out. I'd start getting hot and cold flashes, nauseous. I'd start rocking and groaning, and somebody would have to carry me off to a quiet corner, and it would be bad. And then I'd probably have to come home.
Yes, you and I would be in the same corner. Like, I was the person at the sleepover as a kid who's like, "Why are you guys all talking? We should go to sleep. It's really late." But I was also the person at the club who's like, "What is that little white pill? Okay, I'll take that and dance in a cage."
Yeah.
So it's kind of like,
yeah,
right?
That's exactly right. It is. It's that the weird juxtaposition of the two parts of our personality. So I don't know, but I think I probably would have been quite Cece-like, in that I think I would have started off feeling quite scared, and at a certain point I would have, just because for Cece, I mean, it's just a sensory overload, and just at a certain point she has to give in.
It's one of the great pleasures of the book, I think, is reading about pleasure and experiencing that, like, five senses: surround sound, surround feeling, surround taste, pleasure, and then realizing that, oh gosh, this does actually have consequences. And so I totally relate to this because I am a rule follower until the first rule is broken, and then I'm like, let me eat and drink all the things, and I'm like Alice in Wonderland, and that doesn't always have like fantastic results. So you and I would have been in the corner, like with Cece, rocking and groaning, and then going to a diner and eating lots of gravy fries, disco fries, whatever, and then going home and being like, wow, that was a narrow escape. Actually,
Jenna, I just want to say, there is still time. There are many, many nights in our future.
I'll see you next month, sweets. Guys, I'm going to Connecticut to hang out with Jane. So watch this space. Watch this space. Oh my goodness. Do you think this is something I think about a lot, actually, putting myself in heroine's shoes in books and like hero shoes in books? Like, do you think you would have survived it? Do you have a sense about yourself that like you would have survived that scene?
Yes, because I am a good girl. I've always sort of I've often overdone it in my life, but I've also known when to stop. I've known when I'm in danger, and I have always straightened myself out before it got too bad. So I absolutely believe I would have survived. And even though I'm at a stage of life where, I've got beyond that sort of omnipotent, I'm going to last forever phase. Like I know death is there, but I think that my self-protection skills have always kicked in, and I think they would have kicked in then. How about you?
I'm so struck by the whole, like, I know death is their thing, because I do feel as though you get to an age where you think, why are you courting disaster by drinking a whole pint of Negronis or like whatever, or eating that thing or smoking that thing? Like, don't you know it's enough just to keep body and soul together, like just to keep yourself healthy? And at the same time, despite my emphasis on health, I think you like sort of every once in a while get the opportunity to have a throwback to your youth in some way, where you're like, you're at a party and you feel safe and there's something that is offered to you and you think like, I'm just going to do this thing.
Yeah.
And so I'm really interested in that question of like, I guess maybe it's like a like a sybarite balance now, like how much are we sybarites and how much are we rule followers? And I think that's one of the many questions that this amazing book asks, is like, what is the danger zone? Like, what is the razor edge line between being a rule follower and then being a sybarite? So I feel
I think it's also because they were all, Paul Getty was 30 when they married, and she was 20, I think she was 24 or 26. hold on, let me think about this. She would have been 26 when they married. But here we are, much older, and that's kind of one of the joys of aging. I feel like I turned 50 4 years ago and immediately started regressing and just not caring what people think anymore. And actually, all of that self-consciousness that I carried for so many years, and the feeling that I didn't fit in, and I wasn't as good as, or I wasn't adequate enough, I was inadequate in some way, just went. And in my 50s, I think that's actually the best time to experience and experiment, because you do know yourself very well by that time.
Again, watch this space, because I'm coming to you and we're going to go have some fun. I feel like cheers to this, right? And those of you who are like 20 and 20 something watching this, like, I feel as though you do sort of cast caution to the wind in some ways. Like, you're like, oh, my body might be a little bit more creaky, and yet I don't really care anymore about like what other people think.
You can go to a party at this age, and this has happened to me, there can be an amazing band and nobody else at the party is interested because they are all talking, and you can go and stand by yourself by the band, and you can be the crazy old lady who just dances all night, and you don't care that what anyone else is doing. Actually, you don't even care whether they're looking, because you're so kind of lost in the music. Yeah, that's the great thing about being this age.
Okay, first of all, I'm going to say engrossed, as engrossed forevermore, in the same way that when Alex George was on and he said migraine instead of migraine, I'm like, obviously that is the only way to say it. Second of all, I was at a book party last night for Rachel Berenbaum, who's our debut editor, and Jane Roper, who's our Zeitgeist host, was dancing. And so, of course, I took a reel of her.
I saw that. Yes, I saw the video. Yes.
And she was hot and she was awesome. And then she commented something like, like crazy old lady dancing, whatever. I'm like, no, first of all, she proves your point about like, we're just going to do what we feel like doing, which was amazing. But also, I take umbrage with the whole like old lady dancing to the whatever, because like the Golden Girls were like old ladies. Like, we are in our 50s. We are like J-Lo and Madonna and Nicole Kidman. Like, come on. Like,
although, wait a minute, I just have to tell you, like the actress who played Blanche Dubois was something like 52 when she first started playing the Golden Girls.
Okay, I'm going to say one thing about this, and then we're getting back to Sister Stardust.
I'm so sorry. I just brought the whole conversation down by about
No. There is a meme online, and I will post it on my social and Blaze social, about what if the Golden Girls had updated like 2022
I think I've seen
haircuts and makeup, and they actually look hot like us because they don't have like carpet crumbs.
Oh no, I haven't seen that one. I saw one last week of what if Friends were to be filmed today, and they all had plastic surgery with like tiny little noses and the great big lips and big cheekbones, and they all looked like every influencer you've ever seen. I mean, they all look the same.
Okay, you say this is like this bad thing, Jane. Hello, like, why are you saying this about?
No, but I don't care what work you do, but you have to respect your face. You don't want to. I mean, why would you want to look like everybody else? You don't look like everybody else.
Well, I might have a good plastic surgeon. Okay, we are totally like devolving here. Although maybe she'll give me a discount now, which would be so great. Okay, so we have covered all the things most important here about, I feel, personal freedom, about the book, about Marrakesh, about Talita. Oh, I had a question way back there, and I'm going to ask one more question, and then viewers, please ask questions. We welcome your questions. I was really struck when I was reading by the similarity between Talita and like Audrey Hepburn, who also had a childhood of wartime deprivation, and in fact was so slender, and people thought, oh, she's just so chic. But in fact, it was because she was malnourished as a child and maintained this very slender physique into adulthood. And I wondered, there's only a bit of a flashback when Talita is talking to our heroine, Cece, about her childhood, and revealing a lot about what has made Talita, like not the glamour girl that you see, but like the glamour girl plus the sadness in her eyes. What was that experience like for you, rendering that?
Well, I hadn't known. That was one of the things I discovered during the research, that I hadn't known, that Talita's her father was a painter, and in the late 30s, he took his pregnant wife, to the island of Java, which is now Indonesia. It was part of the Dutch East Indies, to paint and to live there and paint. And while they were there in 1940, the Japanese invaded and they rounded up all of the Dutch and they put them into internment camps, prison camps. And the conditions were awful. They were squalid. They were filthy. Prisoners would be, I mean, it was no different to the concentration camps in Germany. It really was. It was, horrific treatment of the inmates. There were not the gas chambers, but in terms of the torture and the random killings. And Talita spent her formative years in a prison camp. And I think that trauma stayed with her her entire life. I mean, that colored everything about her life. And I hadn't known that. So that was another, this was the fascinating thing as well about historical fiction. You never know where the story's going to go. And of course, once I found that out, in order to get that part right, I had to read a number of books and articles and watch movies about the Japanese prison camps and about what that was like, and growing up in a prison camp. And I loved how the story would often go off in a completely different direction, depending on whatever it was that I'd found out. The Rolling Stones. I wasn't interested in the Rolling Stones. And then I discovered that they were actually very linked to Morocco, great friends with the Gettys, and actually Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull were really friendly, that they would stay with them a lot. And Mick Jagger dropped off the tape of Wild Horses, and this is in the book, and left it for Talita to listen to. And in fact, that they, as I said earlier, it informed the whole story. But I loved the research of it, and I have never done this before. I've only ever written fiction, and I now understand why Pam Jenoff, why so many of you stick with historical fiction, because it's fascinating. And I felt with Talita as well, because there was so little written about her and I had to sort of come at it sideways. Every time I'd find something, it was like finding gold. I mean, it just gave me such a thrill. It was so exciting.
That's so right. My sister writes nonfiction, and she's an excellent journalist, and she and I totally geek out over finding some detail you didn't know. Like, I'm working on historical fiction next, and I'm having like a bit of a tough time finding the emotional hook into the story. And so I think just go to the research, because that will impassion you in some way. This is a question that I ask every historical novelist, which you now are. How do you know when it's time to stop? Actually, hold on. I'm going to put this question up from Anissa, our party girl, who also asks really incisive questions. How did you get out of the research and actually write the book? You actually have to have spent a lot of time researching this novel. And that is something that every historical novelist has to balance, because you could go down the rabbit hole endlessly into these facts.
Yeah.
Right?
After I'd been researching for about 9 months, I felt ready to start at the beginning, which was also set in London. So I knew I still had, things to read. But actually, even when I was writing, all I read I only read books from that time period or memoirs. So even if I wasn't actively researching, it kept me in the zone. I stayed in that time period throughout the writing of the book.
Mm-hmm. Did you have, this is a trick that I use often when I'm writing historical fiction, but did you have a soundtrack for the book that you listened to?
I did. And actually, I do have a playlist on Spotify, the Sister Stardust playlist. And I also have, this is really interesting, because there are so many real people and the book is based on so many factual happenings. a lot of people have gone down the rabbit hole of looking people up. I do have, my main Instagram account is Jane Green Author, but I also have the Sister Stardust account, which is Stardust with 2 T's at the end. And I've posted pictures of everyone and lots of like little snips of research and little bits of about them. So if you're reading it and curious about what they look like, that's where to go.
Yes, if you're Stardust curious. Okay, so this brings me to a question that I have wanted to ask. So Jane obviously is a phenomenal, sorry, I'm blocking my own face here, is a phenomenal artist. Like she drew this. And if you're lucky enough to know her, she will send you things like this is Talita. And we saw the photograph of actual Talita at the beginning of the interview. And when my Henry was first like born, like puppy, like she sent me this fantastic rendering of Henry in a shell. And I feel as though Jane can do any artistic thing she wants to do. So one of my questions is, do you ever consider like a sort of career or a side career as a visual artist?
Yeah, that's what I was always supposed to do. I started off, I went to art school, I was a fashion student. I always thought that I would be an artist of some kind. And then I fell into writing, and here I am all these years later. But the fascinating thing about writing this book was that it kind of reawakened my creativity, and I started painting all the characters, and that led to painting Talita's pattern, which I then printed on silk chiffon, and I've just brought out a line of caftans. And look, I finally have the snake pendant. It's actually here. So this is my design, which is snakes were a motif of Talita's life. Oh, look how good you are. The snake pendant, but also the pendant is also based on one that my mother had when I was growing up, which was my father flew to New York in 1973 for the fight between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. And then I think a guilt gift, because he was away with the boys getting up to God knows what. He went into Tiffany and bought my mother a vintage Zodiac pendant, which I always adored. I have lots of pictures of her wearing it and always wanted one. It had this textured background with lines. And so I sort of used that as my inspiration for the background of this lovely, chunky, sort of 60s, 70s pendant.
I wish there was some way I could get a snake pet. Oh,
funny you should ask. No, I do. I'm selling them with a retail partner, but also you can buy them through my Instagram account.
I was going to ask if readers could purchase the snake rings, the snake bangle, and the snake necklaces. And also, I have to show you guys, like, this is something I love so much. This is called the drinking bangle. Oh, yours has a snake on it. Oh my God.
Look, I have a number of prototypes because I was hoping to get them all ready for this launch, but we couldn't get it done because China is, which is where these are from. But yes, I'm working on a number of proper snake themed secret sauce bangles.
Okay, so I thought I was cool. Like Jane and I were doing some event together at some point at a bookstore, and she said I was on tour and I had this bangle that has, you can unscrew the top, it's a flask, and it has tequila in it. And I thought, how ingenious, because, who doesn't want a little extra sparkle at your events? And so with Sister Stardust, I received this bangle, and now it has like a Sister Stardust cocktail in it. Because I drank a lot of my cocktail during this conversation, and now voila, it is refilled. But my bangle does not have a snake on it, and I'm so sad. So I'm going to have to come to Connecticut.
But it will do soon. It will do soon. As soon as mine are produced, you will have one.
Thank you, but I'm going to come and get it. So watch out. It's so great. But Jane is like so multi-talented, and I have been to her house and seen like the sort of the fruitfulness of this. Do you ever feel, and this is a question that I have for many of my creative friends who are like also visual artists and photographers and sculptors and jewelry creators, do you ever feel as though there's an alternate life you could have had as somebody who creates textiles and caftans? And I mean, you made this caftan, and I'm still waiting for my reject caftan, by the way.
Yes, so's my mother. You can fight her for it.
I will. I'll take her on.
Yes, I mean, I didn't really question it because I fell into writing and I loved it and I have loved it. And I'm at a stage in my life where all kinds of other opportunities are coming up, and I'm kind of excited. For the first time ever, I have thought, well, perhaps writing is not part of this next act. I don't know. Or perhaps I think it's always it always will be storytelling. But I just don't know what the future holds. For the first time ever, I'm beginning to see that a future may not necessarily have books in them in the ways that I have done books in the past. But I don't know. I don't know. I also, alongside that, I also have ideas for a couple more books, and so yeah, we'll see.
I think all of your readers here will be very, very sad if you don't continue to write books. Even if you flip it and you have like a main career making like this incredible art and the rings and the caftans and the shelves with dogs in it, like anything Jane wants to do and she turns her mind to turns out to be this beautiful thing. Like if I did something like this, it would look like a stick figure on like a paper plate. Like it would not turn out well. All I can do is write books basically and bake things that look awful and taste good. Jane can do it all.
No. Can I just tell you, your maple bacon shortbread cookies not only taste amazing, they also look amazing. They are my most favorite things in the world.
Thank you. So when I was sending out my last book, because it was about my dog who loved bacon, I bribed people with maple bacon shortbread, which is very hard to say, especially after like several of these Sister Stardust cocktails. But thank you. But I don't have the same sort of intuitive, like I can do everything that Jane has. But we want you to keep writing books. I'm sorry. Okay. And if you had, like, unbelievably, we are coming up on almost an hour. And I would love for you to say to your readers anything that you would like to say about this fantastic adventure.
I know that it is very overwhelming with so many books out right now. But if you make your way to Sister Stardust, I hope that Talita casts a spell on you too. I hope that you jump on the magic carpet and have the ride of your life.
Nothing could be better than that, and it will deliver. So those of you who have not yet bought Sister Stardust, pick up several copies now for you and for your friends who want an escape from the mundanity and everything else that is going on in daily life and want to go back to the 60s in London, in Marrakesh, and into the depths of human nature in terms of pleasure and its darker side and just what unites us all and makes us human. Jane, thank you so much for being here with your beautiful, beautiful self. Thank you.
Lovely always to be with you. Mwah. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Good night, everybody. See you next time on A Mighty Blaze. Thank you. Thank you.